enforcement candidate that maybe Silwa also could saying, why are you voting for a Democrat as a law enforcement candidate? And it looks like our friend Heshi Tishler lost pretty bad, only got like a few percent of the vote. I showed you the Orthodox Jewish periodicals came out pretty hard against him.
I should have him back. He's a good guy, but we'll have to see. Kind of a bit of a loose cannon, but an interesting fellow. Now, Dooovid, I want to just talk a little bit about something that has both a Jewish and an American component to it. And that is that it was about a year ago now that I was invited to attend a school committee meeting in Newton, Massachusetts. Newton is a very large Jewish population. I think it's probably upwards of 30% Jewish.
I'm familiar with Newton. My local Young Israel's rabbi's wife, I believe, is the daughter of the Young Israel rabbi there, or maybe emeritus rabbi of Newton. And
it's very liberal. It's somewhat upper class. And there was a controversy with the Newton Public Schools introducing a viciously anti-Israel curricula. And when I say anti-Israel, I'm not just talking, two-state solution. We're talking like Jews are like massacring women and poisoning wells. I mean, this is like Middle Ages, sort of blood libel stuff. Really unbelievable, right? And this is in a Jewish community. And the school superintendent, who himself is at least nominally Jewish, Fleischman, was very much the spearhead to introducing this particular agenda. And it was being promoted by somewhat of a radical Palestinian group, probably connected to Hamas. I don't know the exact details. According to Charles Jacobs, it was connected to Hamas. And he's a Newton resident. He's a big activist here. And I went to the school board meeting, and Charles Jacobs and several other people gave fiery speeches against this, and they really called down the school committee. How could you allow this to be here in this predominantly Jewish community? And what the heck are you thinking? And they really let them have it, demanded people resign. We have this woman, she's in her 90s. She's a Jewish activist. She's been around forever. She got up and gave this passionate speech, and the audience was like practically heckling the school board. And what I found most interesting about it was that the school board sat there like a bunch of robots. I mean, it was almost like nobody existed. And they had even no facial reaction to some of the charges being made. It was as if they were in some kind of like a strange zone. And then they just sort of, thank you, next subject. They gavelled through and they moved on, said nothing, no comment, no response. And we're talking here about a local school board. This isn't like a big government. This is people who live in the community. I mean, Fleischman lives in Newton, and by the way, gets like 6-figure salary too. And I was just astounded by how, to say they're arrogant doesn't really describe it. It is a very strange thing. And now I'm seeing this same thing going on nationally with regard to critical race theory. And people are getting up and saying, this stuff is poisonous. It's bad for my children. It's creating racial conflict. My children are perfectly fine and friendly with their fellow students of all races. Nobody really thinks about race at that age. And they have this lesson coming in where they're starting to, white people are oppressive and black people are seen as, oppressed, and just this entire kind of Marxist type stuff. And, they're like, and also you have to call a boy a girl and a girl a boy, all that. We don't want to go into that because I'm on YouTube. You can get banned. And I noticed the same reaction from these school boards. It's as if they don't exist. Gavel it through. And then they had one, I mean, this is making the rounds. I'm sure you might have seen it. It's gone viral in the Loudoun School Committee in Virginia, which is a very liberal community, by the way, just, a suburb of Washington, D.C., where this parent got up and said, this is bigotry, this is wrong. And they said, we're ending all commentary for the audience. Then they said, do I hear a second? And they gavelled a second, said, commentary is now over. And the audience erupted, and they started to sing the national anthem, and they started to eventually police came and they arrested 2 people. And I think that I don't know if you have any opinion about this, but there is something really, really strange going on with these school board members. I mean, I assume most of them are elected, and yet it's almost like the kind of arrogance that they're displaying. It's fascistic. I mean, the idea that they would shut down any commentary, who the hell are they? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I'm not surprised by any of that. And if it's highly Jewish, you have to think like long term, the majority strategy of the larger element of American Jews was assimilation. And like I was mentioning, you're related here in Detroit, Michigan. I think they're trying to forward legislation forbidding the teaching of critical race theory. And I actually, I went to the Roper School, which was founded by Anna Marie Bondi, who fled from Nazi Germany and had been a disciple of Freud. And I believe some of her friends that helped her were from the Frankfurt School. And we had like a feeding line actually from the school to Columbia. And I think students, actually studied under some of the, disciples in Columbia of the Frankfurt School.
Frankfurt School. That's what critical.
And, Jay Dyer, like you met, I think Jay Dyer said he got his actually PhD in critical theory. And today, I mean, critical race theory is a derivative
of critical theory. Exactly.
But a lot of people aren't necessarily that scholarly of it, of the history, and saying the majority, not the majority, but there's a sizable element of the left Jewish community in America, maybe even 10, 20, maybe even like 25% of American Jews going back, from World War II, that have largely been on board with critical theory and the natural derivative of critical race theory. And then your current identity crisis. And I mention this all the time, because I'm, so to say, opposed to fighting anti-Semitism in America in the way that most organizations do, because say me and you as Jews, and even, I would hypothesize all Jews in America are better off being judged as individuals. We don't want to be judged as Jews. We want to be individuals, and the assimilationist approach
at groups as such. And yeah, I mean, critical race theory, you're right. I mean, I'm glad you brought it up. It is a derivative of critical theory. Critical theory emanated out of Columbia University in the 1940s and 50s. What they call the Frankfurt School of New Research. And some of the main figures involved are mostly sociologists, some psychologists, and some other social scientists.
Yeah, Adorno, Horkheimer, Margaret Mead might be the more famous name.
Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Wilhelm Reich. A lot of these guys fled Nazi Germany.
But when you first talked to Richard Spencer a few years ago, or Jay Dyer, I'd never even heard of critical, even though I had went to a school that was largely based on critical theory. I had heard the names like Adorno, Horkheimer, or Marcuse as a kid because I had a good education, and some of my teachers were educated, in Columbia under those people. But when the alt-right first was rising, one of the bigger complaints, like Kevin McDonald on Judaism, was this dominance of critical theory, but they more focused on cultural relativity. That was what they were saying, that critical theory is related to cultural relativity because it was a school of anthropology, maybe most widely known to the masses through people like anthropologists like Margaret Mead. That now in critical race theory, it's unclear if you say the connection, what we used to call cultural relativity to what now is being called critical race theory that might even be a pushback of what, when I was a kid being educated, would have been referred to as cultural relativity.
Well, first of all, the people you mentioned, like McDonald and others, they try to make an issue out of the fact that many of these people had Jewish backgrounds, and therefore they put an anti-Semitic spin on it. That somehow it must be a
Well,
Jewish.
they were saying that that was what had won. Like already when, 2016, they were claiming, before critical race theory became so popular, they were claiming the problem in American society was that critical theory and cultural relativism had basically won out in academia. And,
Well, that's a good point. But the point is nothing to do with Judaism. Just because some of the people, not all, but certain of them happen to have Jewish backgrounds, that's not relevant. The important and relevant factor was that it was Marxist and
well, it is
openly so.
relevant because saying like, no, I mean, it's like I went to it wasn't a Jewish school, but like, no, I mean, it was founded by Holocaust survivors from Germany. There
Some.
was a strong Jewish element to the school.
Yeah, but they were
And
Jewish
in
Marxists.
essence, well, I mean, if you're saying Newton, I'm assuming that Newton probably is similar, that it's
Yeah,
mostly assimilated Jews. If there's
very
Orthodox Jews
liberal.
in
Yeah.
Newton now, that's probably a newer phenomenon, and probably, critical theory, like an assimilationist type approach, that people like, the alt-right would have seen hypocrisy. Like, how are you pushing critical theory and
Mm.
assimilation at the same time? But I'm guessing that that's probably the general layout of, if Newton's
Oh,
like
Newton, but I would
20%.
also say that even in Newton, among the very ultra liberal Jews, there's a few shreds of consciousness when it comes to Israel. And when you have this
I mean,
curriculum
there's strong
saying,
stretch of critical theory, probably, even though they
oh,
may
yeah,
not know their own
totally.
history. If you studied it, you might, see, like, no, I mean, a lot of the people who probably became big players on the school board in these theories, maybe even went to Columbia, or had education or direct connection. And
Yes, I agree. But the
it's like
point is that
critical theory
even
had
they
already
have a
won.
few,
Like in Newton, critical theory had probably already won decades ago.
oh, yeah, but even so, there's still a few, in spite of this vicious mindset, there's still a few shreds of morality in them, in that they still don't want to hear such, lies about Israel, killing women with poisoning the wells and just the kind of stuff that you would have heard in the Dark Ages in Europe. The Jews were responsible for the bubonic plague. Even they were upset by this. But putting that aside, nothing was done because the
From their
establishment
identity
was
crisis, that they've been successful as Americans, and the Jewish identity is probably secondary. So when they hear attacks on Jews, they may not, deflect it. They may already be intermarried, largely assimilated. Probably Newton, even though they push for integration and African American rights, is probably predominantly white. And
it is
and it's really an identity
overwhelmingly.
crisis, saying that, like, so some of their kids and grandkids might be becoming Chabad or Zionists due to the identity crisis. But at this point, really, they have no choice but to keep on doubling down
Well,
on
but the point I'm making
the
here, brother,
tactics they've been. I mean, so just saying,
you're
like,
right.
why are you
But even
surprised? They're saying, like, of
even
course
with
they're
those,
doubling down on the tactics they've been using for
yeah,
decades.
even with these inhuman ideals that they've embraced, what I'm saying is that even they still have a few shreds of common sense and humanity when they hear the curricula as described at this meeting, which was absolutely viciously anti-Semitic. It went beyond just opposing Israel, supporting two-state solution, Palestinian rights. That's all
I
fine.
think they
This
disagree. I'm
went
saying, like,
beyond
I
that.
mean, what you
This was
call
like,
the anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
no, no, this was
If you're
more.
from a critical theory, school, like, and we mentioned like Andy Meisner, and quite a few Jews in Metro Detroit have came out in support, is that you really do have to be against Israel if you're going to be
All
true.
right, fine.
If you're
But
going to
even
be true
even
to
in
the
that,
critical theory or the
Dooovid,
liberal
even
ideology.
in that school of being anti-Israel, this curricula goes beyond that. This is more than anti-Israel. I mean, this is saying that the Israelis are doing these bizarre atrocities. This is like, as I said, this is Middle Ages stuff. This
It's
is
a fight for the Jewish identity. So it's saying that's saying, like, if you're a proponent of critical theory or liberalism, assimilation from a Judeo perspective, Zionism and Orthodox Judaism is the biggest
I understand,
adversary.
and I
So
also
in order,
note,
you have to kind of like straw man and make Israel
right,
worse
but I would
than it
even
is, because
note
it's
that
a fight for Judaism, saying like
most
people in
people of
Newton don't
Newton,
want Orthodox
no,
Jews taking
yeah, but
over.
they
They
also
don't
are
want
Zionists.
Zionists taking
Yes, they
over.
do. Yes, they do.
Well, I mean,
Most
you may want that, but it's saying
No, most
that
people in Newton, even the most ultra liberal, are still supportive of Israel. I mean, there's only a fringe that isn't. And so I think that regardless of their embrace of critical theory and their ultra liberalism, they still maintain a basic support for Israel, including the most liberal of synagogues in Newton.
Well, you
That's
go back to Kevin McDonald's, like, you know, it's like for D, you know, for D, nish for me, you know, for you, not for me, and that you know that it's the blatant hypocrisy to push critical theory on Americans, and at the same time defend against critical theory in Israel.
okay. Now, I just want to, this is a quick side note here. I'm running live on TikTok, and some of my TikTok followers want me to comment on a topic that I can't comment on because we're live on YouTube, and that is, in a nutshell, the head of the Michigan Republican Party coming out with a statement that the election had been great and everything was fine and kosher, and that he made reference in a very sneering way to the Maricopa County audit as being less than good. I can't comment further on that because we're on YouTube, and it is a topic that is verboten on YouTube. I just wanted to say that. So please be patient with me on TikTok. Maybe after the program, I'll do a little live stream on TikTok where I can get into some details on that. Dooovid, getting back to the subject at hand here. So the critical theory is directly correlated to the critical race theory. And I think that I'm starting to study it. In a nutshell, what it does is it looks at it deals with the sociological look, which is fine in and of itself. It opens up C. Wright Mills, who I think was part of this, opened the lens to look from the personal or the problems of an individual to the greater societal problems by looking at a social structure and then comparing that to the other social structures that exist. But if you take that idea and you put it into the conflict theory in sociology, and I'm talking about this because I'm actually studying sociology right now. I'm getting a degree in sociology.
Good for you.
Thank you. The conflict theory is Marxist. The idea that groups have to be, in a sense, they exist and they have to be pitted against each other to create a dialectic and a conflict, and that the critical theory and then they apply it to race, is that you have to look at groups based upon their race, and you have to consider a dominant group that is oppressing a lesser group. That is, I think, the theory in a nutshell. It does not consider the individual. It doesn't consider the fact, and it basically, when you go down that road, you then are told that all people in the dominant group, which is called white, as it's presently defined, are privileged and are racist, that they have something against all the other groups inherently, and that racism is not necessarily conscious. It's just ingrained. It's who they are. A lot of these ideas were promoted by Harvard professor Charles Pierce in the 1980s, who continued this line of reasoning and who's seen as the father of the microaggression theory, which is that your racism is subconscious, and that it can be detected under a microscope, really. If you look this way, you do that. I mean, an example recently is that for the Juneteenth holiday, there was a hotel that served fried chicken and watermelon, which is ethnically associated with Black people, just like bagels and lox are associated with Jewish people, or spaghetti and meatballs might be associated with an Italian festival. And they were placed under attack for being racist for this. So, it can become insane. In other words, it looks for racism in places where it really doesn't exist. Maybe this is a statement of how progressive we've become as a society, and that we no longer have, Jim Crow and open institutional racism. So the people who want to benefit from racism have to do this. They have to go into a microscope and try to find a racist cell, like a racist moment. And I just want to conclude that
You don't have anything good to say about critical theory or like Margaret Mead?
no, I just want to conclude
Absolutely
by
nothing
noting
good. You don't have nothing. I mean, even like
Margaret Mead
critical
was a
theory in
complete
law or
fraud. And Dooovid, I just want to finish by noting that they only take out the microscope if it's someone who's not goose stepping to the left. In other words, if you're goose stepping to the left, you can be like Joe Biden, who has a long history of making terribly racist comments, using the N-word in public in the Senate, talking about integrating schools and turning them into jungles. And a lot of this stuff is on tape, but that's ignored. Whereas if someone is not genuflecting properly to the establishment left, and they so much as like this scene in a hotel lobby in 1958 with David Duke or something, then they're destroyed. Their career is ruined, and their reputation is in shatters. So I'm just saying that the entire theory, putting aside the emptiness of it, is used subjectively as a political weapon and as a cudgel against opponents of the left. And look, there is one element of critical race theory that's fine. It's not totally bad in that it is bringing up some history of the way Black people were treated in the United States, which I think is good and valid. And it actually was a lot worse in a way. Like they talk about the Tulsa riots. There were ones that were worse than that at that time. I think that's good. I think we need to do that. That's conventional. That's what we should do more of it. The problem, that's not the problem with it though. The problem is the sociological piece that's going to create group consciousness and going to pit groups against each other. That's where that's what parents are agitated about, not actual study of history.
I mean, what do you see then? Like, if you're looking at, probably the majority of Jews that assimilated and became successful and are in Newton or suburbs where I live in Metro Detroit and probably similar around the nation, like Miami, even God forbid, where the building collapse is, that some extent we're kind of like we took advantage, so to say, of being white, but we're always mindful of oppression of other people and took this assimilation tactic where we're just basically Americans and we don't want to be pinned into a Jewish identity by the state or by any institutions, even though our Jewish identity might be important to us, or even though liberal Jews historically also leveraged our wealth and influence in America to help out Israel, even till today. But I'm kind of pessimistic, and I would defend critical theory to some extent because I was educated under it. I know a lot of American Jews that I would say in essence are good people trying to do the right things, even though I agree with the vast majority of your critiques. But I keep saying, like, what choice do these people have but to keep on doubling down? I mean, other like they're going to become Orthodox, they're going to repent and become Chabad, and then if they become Zionist, saying at the end of the day, the Zionist perspective is going to be, well, we don't really belong here. That in essence, our shared destiny is not in America, but in Israel. That like the reform going back in Germany, that as doctrine said, we do not plan on rebuilding the temple, and we do not plan on returning to Israel. And then you're going to make a reverse and saying that now we're Zionist, but doesn't that eventually say like, no, our shared destiny isn't here in America, but in Israel? And what path do you see forward other than to keep on doubling down?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that you make the point that you really can't be a quote Zionist unless you make Aliyah and you go to Israel. That is weird because that's Zion. But you can be supportive. You can recognize the importance both politically and theologically of the existence of a Jewish state in Zion, in Palestine, and work to help that.
Only by
Uh,
pushing for for somewhat the opposite principles in a foreign land than we're pushing for here in America.
I don't think it
Like I mean,
contradicts
Kevin
America.
McDonald's essential
Well, I don't agree with that. No, I
critique
don't.
that
No, I don't agree. Look, I mean, what you're using the argument that was used by the Council on Foreign Relations and by much of the international establishment in 1948, when, for example, Secretary of State Marshall uh, told George Marshall told Truman, and as his Secretary of Defense Forrestal, not to recognize Israel because it would hurt America. It would hurt our oil interests. You know, the Arab countries are against Israel, and they're wealthy, they're vast. You know, do we want to piss off half the world? I mean, it would create, you know, it's not in our interest. It's not in our economic interest to support Israel.
right, and bring
And
another dimension of the
well, I mean, that's
besides
the
Israel,
argument
the
they're using.
segregation. Like when the Russian Jews came to America, largely the push from the Federation, even though the vast majority of Russian Jews were more secular, was to not send them to public school and to fund them going to Jewish schools. So if you're talking about
Well, the same thing with
a
Catholics.
place
by
like
the way.
Newton, where probably they had very good public schools or elite private schools that were integrated, that if the school board, agreed with you on this, Charles, that they would probably have to, segregate and stop going to public schools and start going to Jewish schools, and that would probably, push back on what allowed Jews to become successful. I mean, the reason
Well,
here in
first of
Metro
all, Dooovid,
Detroit and the
that
suburbs
particular
that Jews are
curriculum,
successful is because of integration, because we went to public schools or even private schools that were largely integrated, even if it was majority whites, but all types of people. And that as Jews around the nation, here in Detroit, probably Boston also, make a turn to the right. I mean, you're talking about the school board, that they would probably segregate and stop sending them to public schools in the first place.
well, first of all, the curricula being pushed in Newton was interesting. One of the reasons it was interesting is it was only Newton that was targeted. I mean, there were none of the other 300 schools and school boards in Massachusetts were. Only Newton, which is unusual because I suppose that they figured Newton they could get away with it because it is so ultra liberal, but it also happens to be Jewish in a lot of ways, or a high percentage. But
The
getting
five
back,
towns also, like in the five towns, Lawrence Public School, which used to be, extremely good public school, like maybe even like 50% Jewish. At this point, most of the Jews now go to private schools. There is no longer this
but
large Jewish
getting
population
back to
going to these public schools.
the Israel question, whether it's in America's interest. As I mentioned, all of the major establishment figures in the United States at that time, particularly conservative leaning, considerably liberal leaning, were anti-Israel. They were to Truman, don't do this, don't recognize Israel. And Truman almost unilaterally went ahead and did it anyways. And the reason that he did it, and the reason why ever since Israel is supported by Americans, both liberal and conservative, both Democrats and Republicans, both left and right, other than the extremes, is not because it's necessarily in our financial interest, but because it's the right thing to do, and because it has to do with our Judeo-Christian heritage. Because Christians, and even to a certain extent Muslims, I may add, also agree with the religious mission of Israel, which is that the Torah tells us to take possession of that tiny piece of land. The Torah, God told Abraham to go up to that piece of land. He divided it into 12 tribes when Moses was in the desert and told each tribe where to go. He told, it's something that is in the Torah. Why God said that land, we don't know. That's a mystery. But it is in the Torah. And eventually, with the development of the Messianic idea, it became an understood concept that the children of Israel would have to take possession of that piece of land in order to usher in the Messianic age. And this is something that is a predominant belief, not just in Judaism, but in Christianity and Islam. So America,
Unfortunately, I mean, the statistics are clear that Jews in America believe that, the least, and it goes back to the point like critical theory and the assimilationist strategy that the majority of successful American Jews that chose assimilation reject the Bible and took a more secular humanist approach. So, like, per force, we have to reject what you're saying, that like, no, we're not Christian. We don't believe in the
well, they
biblical
reject God.
narrative.
They're rejecting the whole Decalogue. The point is,
I mean, I mean, the
and that
recent Pew
is,
survey
I'm
that's
talking,
that's
however, about,
factually, that you call what you call the Judeo-Christian heritage. The most likely people in all of America to reject the Judeo-Christian heritage are in fact Jews.
probably true, but that doesn't change the fact that it is the Judeo-Christian heritage. And
I'm assuming the Jews you're talking about in Newton and the school board, like,
yeah, you're absolutely right.
they're
Absolutely.
not fans of Christianity, and they want to keep Christianity out
They're
of
not
the
fans of,
schools.
they're not fans of God. They don't
Well,
want
I mean,
to.
they've been fighting to keep Christianity out
I
of the
agree.
schools, and then so they
Although
really
they seem
have
to have
they
an
really
awful
have no
fuzzy,
choice but to keep on doubling down.
although, Dooovid, they seem to have an awfully warm and fuzzy feeling about Islam, I might add. But putting that aside, yes, this is a high percentage of Jews, and unfortunately a good percentage of Christians as well, have rejected faith. They've rejected God, they've rejected religion, they've rejected the whole idea of the Torah. What I'm saying here, however, is that Judaism is still what it is, regardless of whether people accept it or not. As is
We
Christianity.
argued that last week, and I said, like, Judaism is critical theory to a lot of Jews. So you could say, oh, Judaism, it's in the books, it's in the Bible, but like, no, I mean, in certain areas, Judaism means critical theory to,
Well, they've
to the
tried to
majority
claim that,
in a democracy.
well, what they are is socialists. I mean, they've tried to basically step away from Jewish faith. This is the whole business with the critical school. The Jews who were part of that movement at Columbia University, they were socialists. They
This
didn't believe in
argument so many
God.
times, even with anti-Semites, God forbid, is Judaism what the books say, or is Judaism what Jews do? And if you say,
It's
even
what
like
specific Jews
not to
do,
not
but
to side with
Judaism,
Kevin McDonald, but saying if
no,
Jews
no.
do critical theory, is Judaism critical theory?
He's talking about socialism is critical theory, and a lot of Jews have embraced socialism, as have Christians.
Is Judaism what Jews
No,
do,
Judaism
or is
not critical
Judaism,
theory. Judaism is
what,
God and Torah.
but
Now,
there's
so
also an element, it's a people, and
a portion
Judaism
of
is
the people have
representative
fallen
of
away.
what the people do.
Yeah, and a portion of the people have fallen away from faith, just like.
But they haven't necessarily fallen away, because most Jews who do critical theory, Judaism is in fact the main driving force. That
do they believe in God?
Well, I mean, that's why I bring back like Nator.
Do they believe in the Torah?
The same complaint of religious.
Do they believe in Israel? I mean, do they believe
Israel.
in any of the moral and ethical precepts that God handed?
Every time you do this, I push back the same arguments that the religious anti-Zionists say against Israel, that the state of Israel has nothing to do. The state of Israel is against Judaism, is not in line with the sages.
Here, which is the secular Jews. We can talk about the religious anti-Zionists. It's a separate subject. We're addressing right now the people, for example, in Newton who embrace critical theory, and these school boards who are telling parents, shutting down their meetings for parents who are rejecting critical race theory.
Is that representative? I'm saying yes, that is representative of Judaism and of their Judaism.
It is representative of Jews who have broken away from Judaism in the de facto sense. They may not want to admit this, but they are I mean, I don't want to go over this again, but they're followers of Shabtai Zvi. But that's a whole different ball of wax.
I'm saying Jews don't have the right, like the Reform Jews who voted to say we have no interest in rebuilding the temple or returning to Israel. And in your theory, you're saying they're no longer Jews.
No, I'm not saying that. In fact, Reform.
But saying no, that's representative of their
put it this way,
democratic view of Judaism.
They have
that
some
if Jews
serious,
vote, it's okay to eat pork.
First of all, they don't say it's okay to eat pork, and they have not rejected Israel. During the Hamas war, I actually went to. This was not the most recent one. This was about 2 years ago. I happened to be at that time visiting relatives in New York, and my wife and I actually went to a service at a Reform synagogue that was there to talk about Israel. And I have never seen more pro-Israel a rally in my life. I mean, the rabbi was breathing fire for Israel. These were Reform liberal Jews. So they're not anti-Israel. They might have some deviation
I mean,
on what
theologically, I didn't say anti, but say theologically that no,
theologically,
I do
sure.
not plan on returning to Israel. When I
Okay.
call myself a Jew, that does
By the
not
way,
include the
that's not a,
desire to go back to
I don't
Israel
think
and
that's a
rebuild the temple.
consensus. I don't think that's a consensus in Reform Judaism either,
But I
because
mean, they
there
already
are,
voted on that in Germany. I mean, at least
yeah,
a certain.
maybe a century ago, but now you have Reform Jews in Israel who are opening synagogues. They call it what they call dati. So, I don't know if that's a consensus view. If it is, fine. It's a deviation from conventional Judaism. They're still Jews. I mean, it's not a complete break. I mean, Judaism is a very varied thing. I mean, there are many different levels. That's why they say if there were three Jews, there are three synagogues. But
It was like in Newton, they're saying like we don't want Chabad coming in and turning our kids into Orthodox Jews, and saying, well, if Chabad is more representative of Judaism, but if the Jews in Newton say like we don't want our kids becoming Orthodox, and even though that's
fine.
more
But
representative, is there some democratic view that people could
that's
say?
one thing. But it's another thing if the same Jews embrace blood libels against Israel that are lies.
But then just have
That's
group conflict. I mean, God forbid that anyone would do that. But I mean,
but that's what this
that's just the natural
curriculum is.
extension of group conflict, where if there's one path of Jews that have taken a different path, and then opposing path of Judaism, that the dirty tactics of group conflict, God forbid.
Well, that's right. That's what critical theory is: group dynamic, group conflict, Marxism, the dialectic. Karl Marx took the theories of Hegel, which are natural to an extent, and he weaponized them, he politicized them, and he decided that the best thing would be to define people based upon these categories, which are mostly artificial, and that's especially, by the way, true with race, and then pit them against each other, create conflict as a way to create a new consensus, a new kind of what he called a synthesis, which would be socialism.
We tie this back into the New York City mayoral election, that if Maya Wiley, who I believe is married to a Jewish man, and part of leftist liberal type Jewish Arc or these liberal organizations, versus Eric Adams, that is largely recognizing the validity of Orthodox Jews, and very friendly with the mainstream Orthodox
right.
rabbis.
Also a closet Republican, I think, is at least it's being said.
But it's saying that Maya Wiley, that the mayoral race, to some extent, I mean, because of the list voting, that it's still conceivable Maya Wiley could come out in front of Adams and possibly Gonzalez also, but Wiley has the best chances. But it's a fight for the definition of Judaism. Maya Wiley, by force, a woman who didn't convert and married a Jewish man, and has affiliations with leftist critical theory derivative Jews, versus Eric Adams, that largely is in long-time working relationship with the mainstream Orthodox rabbis. To some extent, is a fight over Judaism. If Eric Adams wins,
possibly,
it's going to be a return to power of Orthodox Jews, even though as opposed to Maya Wiley actually comes out of the De Blasio office, and in like I mentioned, congregation Simchas Beit Torah, the homosexual congregation in Chelsea, and I showed you those pictures on Facebook that he carried a Sefer Torah. Mayor de Blasio was at their event carrying a Sefer Torah with the gay flag, and so Maya Wiley will be a continuation of the de Blasio view on Judaism, as opposed to Eric Adams will most likely take his lessons on Judaism from the Orthodox Haredi rabbis in Brooklyn.
Yeah, but I think the only way they're going to pull that off is with this so-called rank voting, which is a fraud. It's a conspiracy.
32%. But I'm just saying that conceivably Maya Wiley could, even though Adams got like 32% and she only got into 20%, when they add up all the tallies, it's conceivable that it's going to be Mayor Wiley.
It probably could be, because of this fraudulent system that's rigged in a way that'll help only leftists. I'll give you an example. In Maine, you had a candidate for Congress, a Republican, I think his name was Golden, who won his race by, I think it was 49%, almost 50%. But because it wasn't 50%, they went to the runoff system, and the thing was rigged in such a way that I mean, I don't understand the intricacies of how they did this, but they were able to create these coalitions of second and third votes to go to certain people as a way to stop Golden from being seated in Congress. And they did. And they ended up putting in a very left-wing figure because of using these second and third votes. And I think that that is un-American. Golden won his election because he had the most votes, even if it was less than 50%. The person who has the most votes wins, or should win, even if they only have one more vote than their opponent. That is how our system works. Every single vote is counted, and every single vote is counted as such.
As our system used to work. I mean, maybe you could have, should have, would have, but I mean,
you're
giving a history lesson, Charles. That's how our system
I
used to
understand,
work.
and we don't even want to talk about the 2020 election because this is YouTube, and I could be banned. But let's just say votes are not counted anymore based upon one vote, one person. They are estimated, let's just put it that way, in advance. And it's undemocratic, it's un-American, and it puts power in the hands of these ultra-left, illuminated establishment, international elitists who are anti-American and who don't give a crap about this country. Anyway, Dooovid, on that note, I want to wrap it up because I download the show to Rumble and BitChute and Gab, and I have all these other excellent services, and they don't take a program that runs over an hour. So I just would mention as a note that you can find out all of the programs that carry my show by going to my website, charlesmoscowitz.com. And of course, my new book is out there, The Satanic Conspiracy. Dooovid, what do you have coming up on your show?
So I hopefully I'm going to stream tonight in my house, actually, for the first time in a while with Deshaun Marquell McClintock, who I believe you're friends with on Facebook. And, because of COVID-19 social distancing at this point, the restrictions, I believe, have been completely lifted. So I might have him in my house tonight to stream. And related to, he's, like the Jews of color. So ironically, Jews of color lean conservative, and even like I have a little bit Cherokee blood.
Of course they do. Most people follow
even I have conservative leanings, and Deshaun is much more conservative leaning than me. So it's interesting.
I'm not.
We'll talk about this and
only natural. In fact, I think that most people.
He's much more in agreement with you than me. So it's going to be a similar conversation.
Tell him to send me a note. I'll put him on my show. I'd like to talk to him.
Yeah, he's doing better also. That he's finished his maybe his second degree almost, and he's doing got his own business running up. So hopefully give an update. So it's not finalized, but hopefully there'll be some point tonight. And once he's got his, he used to have to come to my house just and I help him out with the tech. But I think he's doing financially better. I mean, he was on the radio at Wayne State University using their equipment, but if he's doing well enough to invest in a computer and stuff, hopefully he'll get up and
tell him he's welcome on my show if he wants to drop me an email.
Maybe even next Thursday, if it works, we could come on together. That our next Thursday partners in Torah, we'll do it together, me and him from my house.
That'd be great. We could do a three-way. All right, Dooovid, listen, as always, thanks so much.
Great. Have a great week.
Next week.